All right, good morning. Hey, my name is Bobby Harrington, one of the pastors here. We're going to be in the fourth and final week of our Master's Plan sermon series. So if you have a Bible, go ahead and turn to John chapter 4. If you don't have a Bible, it's going to be also on the screens. Many of you have probably heard the phrase, seeing is believing. What we mean by that is if we could see something with our own eyes, then we will actually believe it for ourselves. Here's the problem, I think, with that statement. It's a very weak sense of belief, the way that statement is used. Because the way the Bible talks about belief, it's trusting something. It's entrusting your life to something. And when we say seeing is believing, we basically mean we mentally assent that something exists. But that doesn't necessarily mean we entrust our life to that thing. Let me give you an example to kick us off here this morning. Some of you maybe have heard of a guy by the name of Charles Blondin, a French guy. He grew up basically as part of the circus. He was an acrobat, tightrope walker. And in the mid-19th century, so around 1850, he comes to the U.S., and he's enamored with Niagara Falls. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever been to Niagara Falls, but it's an amazing place, and he was just enamored with it. And being a tightrope walker, he wanted to be the first to walk on a tightrope across Niagara Falls. Now, he ends up doing it, and he's really an amazing guy. And so once he ends up doing it a couple of times, he began to be really daring, and he would carry stuff with him across the falls. One story is that he goes out to the middle of the tightrope, he cooks an omelet, no lie, and lowers it down to, if you've ever been there, the little tourist boat that goes underneath the falls. One time they said he put his manager on his back and walked all the way across the tightrope. We're talking 1,000 feet across Niagara Falls. One day, the story has it, and you can go look this up. There's tons of stuff out there. The story has it that 20 to 25,000 people were there to see him go across Niagara Falls. And he goes across a couple of times, and the people obviously are just freaking out about it, watching him go across Niagara Falls. And he gets a wheelbarrow. And he says, who believes that I can walk this wheelbarrow across Niagara Falls? And people are like, well, I don't know. So he gets the wheelbarrow. He goes all the way across, 1,000 feet across. He comes all the way back. Then he fills the thing with rocks, like 100 pounds of rocks. And he asks everybody, who believes I can walk across with the rocks? And people have seen him go across without the rocks, and people are like, okay, well, most of us, honestly, we probably do believe that you can go across with the rocks. And so he does that. He goes across with the rocks. And then he gets back for the third time, and he says, who believes I can put a person in the wheelbarrow and go across? And at this point, obviously, everybody's like, yeah, we believe you can do it. He's like, who will get in the wheelbarrow? Nobody. Because seeing is not always believing. You see, all of them, I think, mentally agreed. Yeah, you can put a person in that wheelbarrow and go across Niagara Falls. I'm not getting in that thing. And if we could be honest, you couldn't pay me $1 million. No offense to the French people, but to go across with a French guy in tights with a sketchy mustache, there is no way I would entrust myself to a person like that. You see, the Bible, when you think about it, think of this. How many people saw Jesus' miracles? Probably in the thousands. I mean, you just think of when he took the fish and bread and multiplied it. I mean, there was probably 15,000 people there. And it said all the people followed him after that. They believed in his miracles, but very few people followed Jesus as Messiah. So something's different than just seeing and believing and actually entrusting yourself to something or someone. See, some of you may be here today, and you would just say, even if maybe you don't come to church a lot, you would say, I believe in Jesus. Maybe you grew up in the South, you're like, I believe, but have you actually entrusted yourself to him? Have you got in the actual wheelbarrow? You know, some of you would say, I'm a Christian, for sure. I believe in Jesus, I'm a Christian, I know I'm going to heaven, but if we were to look at the wheelbarrow and who's actually pushing it and who's holding you up, maybe it's money or success, and it's not actually Jesus you've entrusted yourself to. It's something else that you ultimately trust, that your life is sitting on something else. So this story in John 4, I think, is going to challenge all of us to not just mentally assent to the fact that Jesus is God and he can do miracles, but that he is the Messiah. And we're willing to sit down in the wheelbarrow when Jesus is in control. The main point of the sermon today is this: Jesus' miracles point to Jesus as the Messiah. His miracles point to him as the Messiah. We're going to see two parts to this story. The first one is the official's belief. The main character of the story today is going to be this official that we meet, and we're going to see the official's belief. And then at the very end today, we're going to see his family's salvation. Official's belief, family's salvation. All right, let's jump right into the dead center of John chapter 4, verse 43. We're kind of jumping right into the middle of a progression of a story here in John chapter 4. It says, after the 2 days, he departed for Galilee. Now, before we meet this official, I want to give you some context for what's happening. So, Jesus has been somewhere for 2 days, and now he's about to go to Galilee. And if you remember from last week, those of you who weren't here, Jesus has spent the last 2 days in Samaria. Now, the first 4 chapters in John, there weren't really that many people that were following Jesus. I mean, he got his disciples to follow him. Nicodemus in chapter 3 comes to Jesus at night and is asking him all these questions, but it's not clear if Nicodemus really believes. And so going into chapter 4, not all that many people are following Jesus. Well, then he meets this woman at the well who has 5 husbands, not 5 at once. That'd be terrible for any woman. She's had 5 husbands, married and divorced 5 times, and Jesus knows everything about her and her baggage and her brokenness. And he meets her right where she's at. She believes in him. She follows him. She goes back and tells the village. They believe, they want to follow, and they want to hear Jesus for themselves. Jesus comes and speaks to them, and now you have a real revival in Samaria. The Samaritans and the Jews typically hated one another, and so all of these Samaritans are now following Jesus, and we really see a revival in John chapter 4. And now, though, Jesus is leaving there after 2 days, and he's going to where he's actually from, in Galilee, kind of this small region where he's from. And look at what verse 44 says. It's almost like John is just sort of adding this to just give us some context here. It says, for Jesus himself had testified that a prophet has no honor in his hometown. So Jesus goes from this place. These people typically hate him in Samaria, but now they love him and are following him. Now Jesus is going back to the place where people should love him, his hometown, his home region, and it says that a prophet's not honored in his hometown. And if you look at all the Gospels, you know that this is true. John 1 says that Jesus came for the Jews and they didn't believe in him. You go to John 7, it says that Jesus' own family, his own brothers, mocked the idea that he could do miracles and didn't believe in him. I read this story this week in Luke chapter 4 when Jesus is in the small town where he's actually from, Nazareth. I'm talking about this is like his home. High school reunion back in Nazareth. Okay? He goes to Nazareth, and in the temple, in the synagogue, when they're meeting, they're going through the Old Testament, and Jesus stands up and he connects himself to the Old Testament. It says that the people took him out of the synagogue and tried to literally throw him off a cliff. So yes, Jesus is not honored in his hometown, in the region that he is from. But then in verse 45, we're told, so when he came to Galilee, so where he's from, this region, the Galileans welcomed him, having seen that all he had done in Jerusalem at the feast, for they too had gone to the feast. So he came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had made the water wine. When you first read this, after everything I've just given you, you're like, this doesn't make sense. He's not honored in his hometown, and now he goes to Galilee, where this is kind of where he's from, and it says the people welcome him. Now, what John is doing here, I'll just go ahead and give it away. He's using irony, okay? Their welcome is not really a welcome. So the way they're dishonoring him is actually the way they welcome him, because they, the people in Galilee, wanted the miracles, but not the Messiah. They wanted the sideshow. They wanted the tightrope walker, but nobody was getting in the wheelbarrow. They wanted the show. Come, Jesus, do the miracles. It already noted that this is where Jesus had done his first miracle in this area of turning the water to wine at the wedding. Now, Jesus was at this wedding, and his disciples were at the wedding. So seemingly, these people really knew Jesus. And yet, They didn't want him because he was Messiah. They wanted to see more miracles. They wanted their eyes and their ears tickled by the miracles. And so they wanted the miracle worker, not the Messiah. This, to Jesus, who is God, is not welcoming at all. It's extremely dishonoring. And so this brings us to part one of the story where we're going to meet this official. So part one of the story, the official's belief. Look at the second half of verse 46. It says, and at Capernaum there was an official whose son was ill. So as Jesus comes up to Galilee, we're told 20 miles away, at Capernaum, there's an official whose son was ill. When this man heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went to him and asked him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. We don't get this guy's name. We just get that he was an official from Capernaum. The assumption is that he heard about this miracle that Jesus had done in Cana of turning the water to wine. And so he knows that Jesus is a miracle worker. And man, this guy probably has money. He probably has power. He probably has servants, which we're going to learn here in a little bit. So this was a very established person, but just imagine where he's at in life. He is at the end of his rope. I mean, if you're a parent, you know this. If your kid gets sick, like really sick, the last thing that you want to do is leave their side. You're not a doctor. You probably have no ability to actually help them, but something about being there makes you feel better, like you can do something. So this guy must totally be at the end of his rope. If things have gotten so bad, they've tried everything. He's used every ounce of worldly wisdom and power and the people that serve him to try to get his son better, and nothing is helping. And so he says, I'm going to leave. That would be literally the worst feeling in the world. To leave your dying son, to say, this is absolutely my last chance, my last hope. I'm going to go try to meet this Jesus who I don't even really know, but I know he's done miracles. And this guy, maybe he's normally easily embarrassed, but not now because his son's dying. And he's at the end of the rope, so he's willing to do anything. Some of you have maybe been there in life. Maybe you're there today, where maybe through sickness or death, there's some circumstance in your life where you have everything that the world has to offer, but there's an issue in your life where you feel like you're just totally helpless to do anything about it. I mean, some of you maybe that are in a marriage that feels broken. I know people that are in that situation feel like, man, it's totally, I have no power to do anything about this situation. People that are facing addiction, sin issues that won't go away. You feel like I can't, I'm trying and I'm trying and I'm trying and I'm at the end of my rope and there's nothing I can do to fix the situation that I'm in. I would encourage you, by the way of application, maybe do what this guy's doing. Hey, Jesus makes some pretty big claims. I'm at the end of my rope. I've tried everything that I can try. I'm going to go to Jesus because maybe he can help me. Look at verse 48. After begging Jesus, look what Jesus says. Jesus said to him, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. Don't miss what's happening here. This verse to me, the first time I read it, feels so out of place. This guy comes basically to Jesus' feet and begs for his son, and it's like Jesus mocks him. Jesus throws a cold cup of water right in the guy's face. How could this not be the most rude, mean-spirited thing anybody that has ever said to another person? He comes begging, his son's dying, and Jesus is making this statement, unless you see signs and wonders, you won't believe. But to really know what's going on here, you got to really get into the text, because when he says, unless you is in the plural here. So if you can imagine, there's a crowd of people here. There's probably a bunch of commotion. There's a scene going on. And Jesus says, unless you, maybe he's not even really talking to the official. He's talking to the people that want to see the miracles. They want to see the miracle worker. They want their eyes and ears tickled by the miracle worker, but they're not willing to follow Jesus as the Messiah. And so he confronts them. He confronts this way of thinking. You see, they wanted to get something from Jesus and not Jesus himself. And I know for me, this week as I was reading through this, as Christians, man, this could be us sometimes. You see, Jesus doesn't exist for us. That's hard to get our minds around. We exist for him. So if we've made us the center of the story, instead of Jesus being the center of the story, this is what we're doing. We don't exist so that he can serve us. It's the other way around. So the question is, do you approach Jesus like a genie or like he's God? Because a genie is all about your needs. I'm using Jesus solely to meet my needs. But approaching him like God, your prayer life may be more about him than it's about you. Because he's God. He's center of the universe. You see, there's a fine line between someone who worships Jesus and someone who uses Jesus. They both may look kind of welcoming on the outside. I mean, it said the people were welcoming to Jesus, but not for the right reason. You see, these people, they were the show, and they wanted Jesus in the wheelbarrow. They wanted to be in charge. And Jesus is like, no, I'm not getting in the wheelbarrow. I'm in charge. You're going to get in the wheelbarrow. I'm the show, not you. And so the funny thing about the official, as all this is going on, it's almost as if like he don't even engage in any of this. Because he comes to Jesus, he begs for the life of his son. Jesus sort of makes this philosophical statement about the people there and them not believing unless they have signs and wonders. And then he just simply repeats what he already said in verse 49. The official said to him, "Sir, come down before my child dies." The word child here is a more endearing term than he used before. So it's almost as if he's saying, Jesus, all this stuff about the belief is fine, but my baby boy is dying. Can you please do something about it? And Jesus, in this great act of kindness and mercy and grace, he's going to do something here. He's going to attempt to move this guy. Right now, he's no different than the rest of the people in Galilee. He needs Jesus for a miracle. He wants to use Jesus for a miracle. Jesus wants to move him beyond that, though. To realize, yes, you have a great need. Your son is about to die. But you have a greater need in the fact that I'm the Messiah. That's what you really need in your life. Jesus wants to move the official from seeing his need for a miracle to seeing his need for a Messiah. So what does Jesus do? Look at verse 50. Jesus said to him, "Go, your son will live." Now, unless we put ourselves in the story here, it's easy to miss what's going on. Because we're like, this is good news, right? Jesus has agreed. He'll heal the guy's son. But just imagine this guy with power, with servants, with money. If I'm this guy, I'm like, hey, Jesus, that's awesome. I appreciate it. But you're going to sort of need to come with me back to our house. Because like, I remember stories in the Old Testament. It's like the prophet needs to be there to do the miracle. Like, you need to be with me. Let's be real, Jesus. You're kind of off the grid. You got no Facebook, no cell phone. If I get down there and my son's not healed, what am I supposed to do? I can't contact you. Totally off the grid. So look at what Jesus is doing. He's trying to get this man to step out. Right now, the guy can believe what he can see. Jesus is trying to get him to move beyond that. See, Jesus, he'll meet us. He'll meet you exactly where you are. But he's not going to leave you there. He meets this guy right in his suffering. Right where he's at in life. This is where this guy is at. That's all. This whole guy's life is right there in his child being sick. But Jesus is not going to leave him there. It's like Jesus is saying to him, hey, you believe I can do miracles. Will you go deeper with me? Can we move beyond that? Because seeing is not always believing. Look at what Hebrews 11:1, how it defines faith. Faith is confidence, it's hope, it's assurance, what? About what we do not see. And that's where Jesus wants to move this guy. Beyond just believing in what he can see and entrusting himself to what he cannot see. He wants to move him from seeing to trusting. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been trying to teach my son, Eli, my 6-year-old, how to ride a bike. And he honestly could have probably rode a bike like 2 years ago, but he grew so fast that he had this little bike that he just outgrew it so fast, he never rode it because his knees are hitting the handlebars, and it just was way too small for him. So recently, on his 6th birthday, we bought him a bike. It's like pretty much a full-size bike. I think it's an 18-inch bike. I think 20 inches is full size. And so I knew, because he's 6 years old, he's kind of a tall kid. I knew within a day or two, he'd be able to ride without training wheels. And so the day after we got the bike, he's like, "Dad, let's take the training wheels off." And I was like, "That's awesome. Let's take it off right now." I was like, "Hey, you're going to fall, though. So you just need to know that ahead of time. Like, this ain't going to be perfect. You're going to fall. You're going to make some mistakes. But over the next 2 days, we're going to learn to ride this bike. No problem." So I had this idea. I'm like, "Hey, instead of going on the driveway," this is sort of how I learned. We went into our backyard where he could ride sort of down this little small hill and sort of learn to get his balance. And if he falls over, he's in the yard. It's not all that big of a deal. So we have a pretty big lot that sort of slopes, just barely slopes from the back of the yard to the front of the yard. So he really likes, for whatever reason, when we were learning to ride, he likes for me to like run in front of him. So he would ride from the backyard to the front yard without the training wheels. I would just run right in front of him just so that he could see me. Obviously, I couldn't do anything, right? I couldn't do anything to help him. If he would have fallen over, he's behind me. Like, I'm running in front of him. So after like 30 times, I'm like, "Hey, we got to move this thing to the road, okay? We have a pretty long street, and it's just a very, very, very small hill." So I'm like, the same principle applies here. I can get you out on the street, and just with a little bit of momentum, you can balance and you can learn to ride your bike down the street. After doing that for a while, you're just going to be comfortable enough just to ride everywhere. So we get out there on the street in front of our house, and he goes, and I'm going to run behind him this time instead of in front of him. Because in front of him, I couldn't actually do anything. But I want to go behind him now because we're in the street. It's like if he falls, I want to be able to grab him if I see him falling over. He rides 5 feet and starts screaming, "Ah!" and takes his feet off the pedals. I'm like, "Eli, what are you doing?" He's like, "I need to see you." And so I try to get him to do it again. He wouldn't do it. He freaks out. I'm like, "Son, I don't need you to see me. I need you to trust me. I'm going to run right behind you. I promise you. If you begin to fall over, I'm going to catch you. I'm going to grab you." He wouldn't do it. I mean, it honestly kind of made me mad. He wouldn't do it. He's like, "Back to the yard." Seriously. He's like, "I'm not doing that anymore." That's what Jesus is trying to get this guy to do. Hey, I'm trying to get you to entrust yourself to me. Like, to trust me, to sit down in the wheelbarrow and say, "You know what? I'm going to let my whole life depend on you." Because Jesus is trying to get him to, "Hey, believe that I healed your son and turn around and start walking the other way back to the house without me. In the knowledge that you believe that I've healed your son." See, no matter how many miracles that you're praying for, that you're wanting Jesus to do, miracles that you've seen, miracles that you see in the Bible, every single person has to move at some point to a point of decision, to move beyond the miracle, to trust in a Messiah. You have to. You have to move beyond what you just can see and move beyond to trust Jesus as the Messiah. So I think as sort of an application for all of us, we just got to ask the question today. In what part of your life do you need to move from reason to trust? Reason says, I mentally assent to the fact that Jesus is God. I mentally assent to what the Bible teaches. Trust says, I'm going to get in the wheelbarrow, I'm going to base my whole life on this. See, some of you may be here today, like I said at the very beginning of the sermon today, you may believe in Jesus, but you may trust in money or trust in success. Or some of you, and I've been here before, some of you may be believing in Jesus, but you really trust your feelings. You get up every morning, you struggle with what's in your past, you struggle to think you have any value in God's eyes, you feel like you have to earn acceptance as a child of God because of your sin. Jesus has declared in the gospel that you are perfectly righteous. But your feelings are telling you, no, that's not true, and so you're believing your feelings. You're believing maybe what you can see, but you maybe need to move beyond that today. Some of you, just in the culture we live in a culture of just sex with no strings attached. For all stages of life, college students, and everywhere around us, that's what we can see. Because that's what the culture would tell us is okay. And so are you going to believe that? Are you going to believe what you could see in terms of that? Or are you going to believe what the Bible teaches? That's when you got to make a decision. Hey, am I going to trust Jesus' word, what he says is right about sex and morality? Or am I going to trust what I feel or trust what I see in the culture? This is why baptism is such a big deal and why we've really been pushing the last couple of weeks. Because baptism is that thing where you're saying, hey, I believe in Jesus as Messiah, and I'm going to follow him with my whole life. I'm putting my whole life. I'm staking everything I got on the fact that Jesus is the Messiah. Look at verse 50, what the man does. The man believed the word that Jesus spoke to him and went on his way. You see, this situation, though intense, it's not very complex. He heard about this Jesus who potentially could do a miracle. He goes to Jesus. Jesus moves him beyond just the need for a miracle to his need for a Messiah. Jesus tests him. Hey, I need you to trust me. And the man steps out and he trusts Jesus. And I can't help but, when thinking about this story, to think about what Jesus knew he was going to do on the cross. Because when you think about it, God spared this man's son. But in just a little while, God would not spare his own son. I mean, you think of John 3:16, that God would be willing to give his son for us. The pain that this father was going through, thinking that his son was going to die. And God was willingly able to do that and give Jesus to us, for Jesus to die in our place. And so if you're struggling to trust God and to entrust your life to him, think of what Romans 8:32 says. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not give us all things? There's no greater evidence that we can trust God than he was willing to give his own son for us. So some of you today just need to step over that line. Because you believe in Jesus, you have the mental assent. But maybe you haven't entrusted your life to him. You haven't trusted him as Messiah, and you just need to do that. Because you're going to realize the things you're going to see after doing that. We often say seeing is believing, but so many times believing is actually seeing. Look at what happens in the last part of the story, part 2 of the story, the family's salvation. Look at verse 51. As he was going down, his servants met him and told him that his son was recovering. So he asked them the hour when he began to get better, and they said to him, yesterday at the 7th hour the fever left him. The father knew that this was the hour when Jesus had said to him, your son will live. And he himself believed in his whole household. This was now the second sign that Jesus did when he had come from Judea to Galilee. You see, there's kind of a debate in commentaries, like, hey, when did this guy really believe? Like, for the sake of his soul, believed in Jesus for salvation. And I think there's arguments that could be made when Jesus initially told him to go home and believe that his son was healed. And there are others who argue, no, it's once he realized, once he started going home, that his son had been healed at the exact same time. That's when he believed. But the Bible uses the term belief, the exact same word, in both places. And so for me, hey, there could be arguments each way, but I think that when he initially believed, that set his life on a trajectory that it was going to change forever. Because that's when he sat down in the wheelbarrow and said, man, this guy Jesus, I'm going to entrust my life to him. And what happens when he goes home? His family believed. I think that is even beyond his family, because it said his whole household. Even the servants who came up to tell him that his son had been healed, they probably believed. You see, so many times, we've been in the sermon series for 4 weeks, talking about sharing our story, the master's plan. So many times we overcomplicate sharing our story with others. Just think about this. I've thought about this week. The most immature Christians in the New Testament seem like they lead the most people to Christ. How long had this guy been a Christian? 12 hours, 10 hours, 14 hours? Most commentaries say he probably wasn't a Jew, so he didn't know the Old Testament, didn't know all that about Jesus. I mean, he knew enough to be saved and place his faith in Christ. But then he goes and his whole family believes. This happens throughout the New Testament. It's not the people with the most knowledge. It's the people that have had their hearts and lives changed. They go out and share their story. One way to say it would be this: sharing your story is simply the overflow of your life change. I mean, just think with me. Think of how natural this would have been for the father. I mean, think about when he initially left. When he initially left, this probably had to be the worst day of his life. His son had literally got to the point of death. And I bet you for the longest time, he wanted his son to be tough. I got 3 boys, I understand this. He probably wasn't that affected when he first got sick. Because he's like, man, if my son has a cold, a sore throat, I want him to be tough. So it wasn't like life-changing for him. And then something one day just changed. He realized, like, hey, this ain't a cold. This ain't a sore throat. Like, man, he went from playing in the front yard, now he's laying in the bed. And now he can't eat. And now every day his face is losing the color of life. And I'm sure his wife, the change that he saw in her, just overcome with worry and fear and anxiety like any of us would be. And all the brothers and sisters. And the dad probably tried to stay strong in the whole thing, but he was probably just thinking to himself, this is the worst thing I've ever been through. And when he left the house, I could just imagine he was saying to himself, God, let this not be the last vision I have of my son. Because when he left the house, that had to be just awful. I mean, he's leaving because the son's at the point of death. And you can imagine when he goes to Galilee, all the sights and the sound and the people, he was probably numb to all of it. You ever been in a situation like that where you're so wrecked with grief and pain that you don't even really know what's going on around you? So in the past, when the father maybe would have never got down on his knees and begged some religious teacher, he came and threw himself at the feet of Jesus because he had no other choice. He had absolutely no other choice. His son was going to die. So Jesus tells him, I will heal your son. Trust in me and start walking back home. What was that walk like? I mean, from the timing of it all, when you see in the Bible, it wasn't until the next day when he got back home. And when he left, his son was in bed. And you could just imagine if he got home and he walks up to the house, and there in the same tree that his son was always climbing, his son's climbing up in the tree in the front yard. And when he looks at his wife, all the anxiety, all the stress, all the fear is gone, and the brothers and sisters are happy and playing. And what's he going to do? He's going to go love and hug and kiss his boy, and then right after that, he's going to sit everybody down and say, hey, I left. You guys sent me because we needed a miracle, but I'm coming back with the Messiah. That would be so natural, wouldn't it? For the dad to share that with the family. This is why you see whole households coming to faith in the Bible. Because when people's lives are changed, the natural overflow of that is to share that story with others. And if you're here today and Christ has literally changed your life, to brought you from death to life, that's your story. The overflow of that is just you going and talking to people about it and sharing that with others. So as we close today, I want to challenge you with just a couple really practical things. Some of you, we've been talking about this for the last 3 weeks, some of you just need to get baptized next week on Easter or the week after Easter. And the reason that you do, because you've been maybe hanging around. You would say, I believe in Jesus, but you got to step over the line and entrust your whole life to him. Baptism is a picture that you have died with Jesus, been buried with him, and been resurrected to new life, and your identity is now in the fact of what Jesus has done for you and the fact that you believe that and you follow that. So if that's you today, fill this out. We take up the offering, throw it in the offering. Some of you, and this is our prayer this week, this is really our prayer as a church. We already have a ton of kids that are going to be baptized next week and the week after. If you're a parent and you're here today, I just want to challenge you to have that conversation with your kids. I mean, just look at this text. The natural overflow of the dad and the mom being changed by Christ is to flow out to the rest of their family. So maybe for you, maybe you didn't have a mom or dad who raised you in the faith, but you have a chance to raise your kids in the faith and to share the gospel with them. And even if you've never had one gospel conversation with your kids, why don't you make it a point this week to say, I'm going to sit my kids down? Because maybe Jesus is already working in their hearts. And we can't make them believe, but let us not stand in the way of what God's doing in their life. Maybe they need to get baptized this week. And as parents, we don't want to stand in the way of that. So our kids team this week is committed to talking with hopefully dozens of families about their kids getting baptized this week, because God is working salvation in their lives. And as parents, we want to help that work and encourage that. The very last thing, let me say this, and then we'll pray and be closed. Man, ultimately, we want to share our story with others. Let our salvation be the overflow of our lives. But coming into Easter, there's an easy way to invite people to come and see. Hey, come and see the Messiah. Come and see Jesus. Come and see the work that he's done. We overcomplicate this. Look, I'm an introverted person. I'd rather be on stage here than going to have a one-on-one conversation with somebody I don't know, okay? So some of you are like that. It could be hard to invite somebody, but it's really not that hard. I was getting my hair cut on Thursday trying to look fresh for this sermon, and the lady cutting my hair, I said, hey, do you have any kids? She said, yeah, I got a 8-year-old boy. I said, I got 3 boys, and they love our church. They love the kids ministry. They love going. If you don't have a place to go, your son would love it here. And the conversation sort of moved on. When I was going to pay and leaving, she's trying to write down the name of the church and where it meets and what time. I said, hey, I got an inviter card for you. She said, I would love to come because I think my son would like that. It's not that complicated. So, hey, take those 3 cards. Just invite somebody this week. What's the worst that can happen? They could say no. They say that 82% of people that are invited to church, especially around a time like Easter, are just going to say yes and come. So why wouldn't we do that? If God has changed our lives, let that overflow to the people around us. Let's pray together. Jesus, thank you for this text. It challenges us. Will we get in the wheelbarrow? Will we entrust not some part of our lives, not one little aspect of our lives, but our entire life to you? Will we get in the wheelbarrow, out on the tightrope, entrusting everything that we have to you? Jesus, you are trustworthy because you are God. You went to the cross. You died for us. You were buried for us, and you were resurrected for us. That gives us new life. That makes us be able to trust you. So help us to do that, God. The people thinking about following you, getting baptized, kids getting baptized, we pray for them, God. We pray that you'd work salvation and faith in their lives and in their hearts and help them to follow you. Jesus, this week, help us to share our story with others, even if it's a simple thing like inviting somebody to come and see for what we're going to see on Easter. Jesus, thank you for our salvation. Thank you for the work that you're doing among us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.